The morning it happened, nobody in that boardroom thought to ask who he was. That was the problem, of course. That was always the problem. But nobody understood it yet. Not the junior associates sitting along the wall with their laptops open and their expressions carefully neutral. Not the senior vice presidents who had flown in from Calgary and Vancouver the night before. And certainly not Natalie Brennan, who stood at the head of the table in a blazer the color of charcoal, and a certainty that she had built this company into something untouchable. The man who walked through the glass doors that Tuesday morning in October looked like he had come to fix something. A leaking pipe, maybe. A faulty electrical panel on one of the lower floors. He was wearing a jacket that might have been olive green once, though it had faded into something closer to gray. His shoes were clean but old, the kind of shoes a person wears long past the point when they should have been replaced, simply because they still do the job. He carried a briefcase, not the structured, leather-bound kind that the men in this room carried, but a soft-sided thing worn at the corners, with a clasp that had been repaired at some point with what looked like electrical tape. He gave his name at the reception desk. He sat in one of the chairs near the window and waited. Nobody brought him coffee. Natalie had not built Brennan Capital Management on luck. She would have been the first person to tell you that, and she would have been right. 22 years. That was how long she had been climbing. First as an analyst at a firm in Toronto that no longer existed, then as a fund manager, then as a partner, and finally, as the founder and chief executive of her own firm. She had done it largely without the networks that made things easier for other people. She had done it by being, in the words of one board member who both admired and feared her, relentlessly, almost pathologically correct. She was also, though she would not have described it this way, someone who read rooms very quickly and made decisions about people almost immediately. When she walked through the lobby that morning and saw the man sitting by the window in the faded jacket, she made a decision. She noted the jacket, the briefcase, the way he sat, not with the coiled readiness of a person who was used to being important in rooms, but with the patient stillness of someone who was accustomed to waiting. She noted that he was probably somewhere in his late 50s, that his hair was more gray than anything else, that he wore no watch she could see. She filed him under the category of person who was probably in the wrong building. Perhaps a courier, perhaps someone from building services, perhaps someone who had wandered in from outside and hadn't quite figured out where they needed to be. She walked past him without stopping. He watched her go. The meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock. By 8:55, everyone who mattered had taken their seats around the long black table on the 32nd floor. The windows looked out over the financial district, over the gray October sky, and the geometry of glass and steel that made up the skyline. Coffee had been poured. Laptops were open. A young associate named Fiona had prepared 17 slides and was quietly terrified that she had made an error in the third one. At 8:57, reception called up to say that their 9 o'clock had arrived. "Send them up," said Natalie's assistant, a meticulous man named Peter who managed her schedule with the precision of someone diffusing something that might go off at any moment. The elevator opened at 9 o'clock exactly. The man in the olive jacket walked in. There was a beat, brief, almost imperceptible, but real, in which the room recalibrated. Fiona stopped worrying about her third slide. Two of the vice presidents glanced at each other. Peter, standing near the door, looked down at his clipboard and then back up, as though the information he was carrying might have somehow changed. The man walked to the end of the table. He set his briefcase down. He looked at Natalie and extended his hand. "Good morning," he said. "I'm Henry Colquhoun." Natalie looked at the hand. She looked at him. And then, in a room full of people who would remember this moment for the rest of their careers, she said, "I'm sorry. I don't think we were expecting you. Could you let us know who you're here with?" Henry Colquhoun said, "I'm here for the 9 o'clock. Natalie tilted her head very slightly. "The 9 o'clock is a meeting with the Colquhoun group." "Yes," he said. A pause. She stopped. Started again. "I apologize. I assumed, but the assumption was already in the room, hanging in the air like something that couldn't be taken back." She had looked at his jacket and his briefcase and the way he sat in the lobby, and she had filed him, and now the filing was visible to everyone. She did not extend her hand to meet his. She gestured instead to a chair. "Please, sit down." Henry Colquhoun looked at his own hand for a moment. Then he looked at her. And then he did something that nobody in the room expected. He picked up his briefcase, turned around, and walked back toward the elevator. "Mr. Colquhoun," he pressed the button. The doors opened immediately, as though they had been waiting. "We can reschedule," Natalie said quickly. "If this isn't a good time, it was a good time," Henry said. "It isn't anymore." The doors closed. The room was very quiet. From somewhere near the window, one of the senior vice presidents said, almost to himself, "That was the Colquhoun Group." Nobody answered him. They all knew what the Colquhoun Group was. That was the problem. Henry Colquhoun had not always been the kind of person who walked out of rooms. For most of his life, he had been the kind of person who stayed, who sat in the chair and waited out the discomfort, and decided that being underestimated was something he could use rather than something he needed to correct. He had grown up in Sudbury, the second of 4 children, in a house where money was a subject that existed mostly as an absence. His father had worked at the mine. His mother had worked at the school board, and then, when that position disappeared, at the grocery store. Henry had been unremarkable in school, not because he lacked the capacity, but because he had learned early that being remarkable drew attention, and attention in his neighborhood was not always the kind you wanted. He had put himself through university doing a series of jobs that he did not often talk about. Washing dishes, delivering furniture, working the overnight shift at a printing shop in the East End of the city. He had graduated with a degree in economics and a minor in mathematics, and no connections worth mentioning. He had started working for a small investment fund in Hamilton. He had been quiet. He had been patient. He had been, by his own later admission, extremely boring to look at. What he had also been, without particularly intending to become it, was correct. Not relentlessly correct the way people described Natalie. Just correct. Patient and correct and willing to wait. The Colquhoun Group had started as a personal portfolio. Then it became a small fund. Then it became a medium-sized fund. Then it became something that institutional investors began to watch, then court, then compete for access to. By the time Henry was 50, he was managing just over $3 billion in assets, had a record that made certain analysts physically uncomfortable with jealousy, and lived in a house in Oakville that was large but not showy, drove a car that was 9 years old and ran perfectly, and wore jackets that he bought when he needed them and wore until they fell apart. He did not do this to make a point. He did it because the point had never occurred to him as something that needed making. His daughter, Celia, had told him on multiple occasions that he was going to walk into a meeting someday and someone was going to call security on him. He had laughed. He had said supposed. That was probably true. He had not thought it would feel the way it did. Natalie Brennan spent the rest of that Tuesday in a state she had not experienced in a very long time. Genuine, unmitigated uncertainty. She sat through 3 other meetings and absorbed almost nothing. She had Peter pull the file on the Colquhoun Group, which she had of course already reviewed extensively, because she was not a person who went into important meetings unprepared. She read it again. She looked at the numbers. She sat with the numbers, and the numbers did not make her feel better. The Colquhoun Group had been in discussions with Brennan Capital for 11 weeks. The deal on the table, a $230 million commitment that would have restructured one of BCSM's core funds and extended its runway by at least 4 years, had been, as of 7:45 that morning, the most significant opportunity in the firm's recent history. The market had been difficult. 2 of BCM's anchor investors had reduced their positions over the past 18 months. Natalie had managed the optics carefully, managed the messaging carefully, kept the confidence of her board carefully. But she knew, and her CFO knew, and 2 of her senior vice presidents knew, that the firm was navigating a period that required exactly the kind of significant, stabilizing commitment that the Colquhoun Group represented. Peter knocked and came in without waiting, which meant it was something he believed she needed to hear immediately. "He's not taking calls," Peter said. "Which calls? Any of them?" I spoke to his assistant. She was polite. She said Mr. Colquhoun's schedule had changed and they would be in touch if circumstances shifted. Natalie looked out the window. "Did she say anything else?" "She said to tell you that he wished you well." The "wish you well," that was worse than a threat. A threat meant there was still something to negotiate. A wish you well was a door being closed from the other side, quietly, with perfect manners. "All right," Natalie said. Peter waited. "That's all," she said. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows a very large mistake. It is not like other silences. It doesn't have the relief of a concluded argument or the blankness of simple absence. It has weight. It sits in the room with you and lets you know it plans to stay. Natalie had been sitting with that silence for 6 days when her phone rang at 7:30 in the morning and the caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. She answered it anyway. She had been answering everything. "Natalie Brennan," she said. "This is Celia Colquhoun." A pause. "Henry's daughter. I hope I haven't called too early." Natalie sat up straight. "Not at all. I want to be clear that my father doesn't know I'm calling," Celia said. Her voice was even and careful, the voice of someone who had thought about what she was going to say. "And I'm not calling to negotiate on his behalf, because that's not something he's asked me to do, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I understand. I'm calling because I think what happened was, I think it was the kind of thing that deserves more than a silence, and I think you probably know what it was, even if it's uncomfortable to sit with." Natalie said nothing. She was very good at strategic silences. This one was not strategic. "My dad is the most private person I know," Celia said. "He spent his entire career being underestimated and deciding that it didn't matter. He made that decision a long time ago and mostly it served him well." She paused. "But sometimes it catches up to you. Being underestimated, I mean. Sometimes you walk into a room and someone looks at you and decides who you are before you've said a word, and it finds the thing in you that you've been quietly carrying. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "I do," Natalie said. She found, to her surprise, that she meant it. "He's not angry," Celia said. "I want you to know that. He doesn't do angry, really. He decided that the meeting had told him what he needed to know, and he acted on that information. That's very much who he is. Is there anything?" Natalie stopped, started again. "I would like to apologize to him directly, if that's something he would be open to." A long pause on the other end of the line. "I don't know," Celia said honestly, "but I think it matters that you want to." The letter took Natalie 4 drafts, not because she didn't know what to say. She knew exactly what to say, which was the problem. Knowing what to say and knowing how to say it were 2 different skills, and she had spent 22 years developing the former almost exclusively. The first draft was too formal. The second was too long. The third was, she thought, too self-serving, too focused on what she had realized rather than what she had done. She threw all 3 of them away and sat at her desk for a long time, and then she wrote the 4th one quickly, without editing, and sent it before she could think about it too carefully. She said she had looked at him and made a decision without asking a single question. She said she knew that what she had done was not only rude but wrong. Not wrong the way a business error is wrong, but wrong in the older sense of the word, the one that didn't have anything to do with strategy or optics or consequence. She said she was sorry. She did not say that the firm needed his investment, though of course it did. She did not say she hoped this could still work out, though of course she did. She said she was sorry, and she said it plainly, and she signed her name. Henry Colquhoun read the letter 3 times, which was more times than he read most letters. Then he set it on his desk and looked out the window at the lake. He could see a corner of Lake Ontario from his office in Oakville, if the light was right, and he thought about what it had felt like to extend his hand and have it simply left there. He thought about all the rooms he had walked into over the years. He thought about his father, who had spent 40 years at a mine and been the most quietly competent person he had ever known, and who had also spent 40 years being looked past by people who had not bothered to ask. He picked up his pen. He wrote 4 words at the bottom of the letter, below the signature line. He wrote, "Thank you for this." He folded it and gave it to his assistant to return. The board meeting happened in November. It was not a pleasant meeting. 2 board members had already heard, through the particular channels that such information travels, that the Colquhoun Group negotiations had collapsed, and they wanted to understand what had happened and what it meant for the firm's position. Natalie told them what had happened, not a version of what had happened, what had actually happened. She told them she had made an incorrect assumption about a person based on his appearance. She told them the assumption had cost the firm the negotiation. She told them she was not going to describe it differently than that. The room was quiet for a moment. One of the board members, a man named Robert Ashby, who had been on the board for 11 years and who Natalie had, over those 11 years, found consistently maddening, said, What do you propose we do about it? Restructure, Natalie said. We proceed with the alternatives we have. They're not as strong, but they're workable. We take the next 18 months to demonstrate that the fundamentals are sound. We earn our way back to the position we were in, and if that's not sufficient, then it's not sufficient, Natalie said, and we deal with that if and when we need to. Robert Ashby looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded very slightly. All right, he said. Brennan Capital Management did not collapse. That is important to say clearly, because these stories have a particular gravitational pull toward the dramatic, toward the newspaper headlines, the receivership proceedings, the executive walking out of the glass building carrying a cardboard box. BCM did not go that way. It contracted. It hurt. It lost 2 of the 3 anchor investors it had been managing carefully over the previous difficult stretch, because word had gotten out about the Colquhoun meeting, in the way that word always gets out eventually, and the institutional world is smaller and more connected than it appears from the outside. The firm's assets under management fell from just over $4 billion to somewhere around 2.6, which is the kind of number that means the difference between certain kinds of possible and certain kinds of not possible. But Natalie cut what needed to be cut. She restructured what could be restructured. She spent the following year doing something she was not naturally inclined toward, which was being visible about what had gone wrong and explicit about what she was doing to address it. Not in a performative way. In a quiet, consistent, slightly uncomfortable way that people who worked for her found surprisingly affecting. Fiona, the young associate who had spent the morning of the October meeting worried about her 3rd slide, stayed. She told someone later that she had thought about leaving, had thought about it quite seriously, actually, around month 4 when things were bleakest, and had decided to stay because of something specific Natalie had said in an all-staff meeting. Natalie had said very plainly, I made a judgment about a person that I had no right to make, and it cost us. I would like us to be the kind of firm where that doesn't happen. I'm not sure we were before. I'd like us to be, going forward. It was not a grand speech. It wasn't particularly quotable, but Fiona thought about it for a long time. Henry, for his part, thought about the situation less than people might have expected. He went back to work. He had other commitments to manage, other negotiations in progress, other mornings of reading numbers that most people would find either incomprehensible or numbing, and that he found still, after all these years, genuinely interesting. He had dinner with Celia on the 3rd Sunday of every month, which they had been doing since his wife passed 6 years ago, and he did not often bring up work at those dinners, and Celia did not press him. He had not told her about Natalie's letter. He had thought about it and decided it was between him and Natalie, and that to describe it to someone else, even Celia, who had made the call that had perhaps made the letter possible, would change its character somehow. He kept it in the top right drawer of his desk. He wasn't sure why. He just did. In February, he was at a conference in Toronto, the kind of conference he attended 2 or 3 times a year, not to network, but because he genuinely found the panels useful, and he saw Natalie across the room at the morning reception. She was talking to 2 people he didn't recognize, and she had her back to him, and he could see from the line of her shoulders that she was working at something. Working at the conversation, working at being present in it. He thought about walking past. It would have been easy. She had not seen him. He crossed the room instead. She turned when she heard her name, and for a moment her face did something complicated. Several things at once, actually, none of them easy to read. Mr. Colquhoun, she said. Henry, he said. Please. The 2 people she had been speaking with excused themselves with the slightly over-casual air of people who have sensed that something significant is occurring. I wasn't sure you'd. Natalie started. I got your letter, Henry said. I should have said so at the time. I appreciated it. She looked at him steadily. I meant it. I know, he said. That's why it mattered. They stood there for a moment in the way of 2 people who have arrived at a place they hadn't expected to be and are taking a moment to understand where they are. How's the firm? He asked. She considered how to answer that. She could have said fine, she chose not to. Harder than it was, she said. Better than it could be. He nodded slowly. That's usually the honest answer to that question for most people, yes. He almost smiled. Not quite. It's not unrecoverable, he said. What you're doing. She looked at him carefully. Is that, are you? I'm just making an observation, Henry said. I've looked at your fundamentals, old habit. The fundamentals are still sound. I know they are. He picked up a coffee from the table beside him, looked at it without drinking it. I had lunch with Victor Shearwater last week. He mentioned he's been looking at BCM. Victor Shearwater ran one of the 3 largest family offices in the country. Natalie knew this. She also knew that his involvement would do more for the firm's position than any single thing she had done in the past 8 months. She was careful not to let her face do what it wanted to do. I see, she said. I didn't tell him what to do, Henry said. That's not. I don't operate that way. But I told him what I thought of your fundamentals. And I told him what I thought of the other thing, the situation. She waited. I told him that a person who can look at what they did wrong and say it plainly is usually a better investment than a person who can't, Henry said, for what it's worth, which may be nothing. It's worth something, Natalie said quietly. He set the coffee back down, untouched. I should let you get back to it, Henry. She said his name and he turned. She looked at him directly the way she had not quite managed to do, she realized now, on that October morning. I'm sorry, I know I said it in the letter, I wanted to say it to you. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her in the way of a person who is deciding not whether to believe something, but how to receive it gracefully. I know, he said. Thank you. And then he walked away across the morning conference room in his faded jacket and his old shoes, unhurried, unremarkable, and entirely at ease with what he was. The room around him continued its noise. He passed through it the way he always had, patient, quiet, and correct. Some people, it turns out, don't need to make a point. The point has a way of making itself, given enough time, given enough room, given one morning in October when someone looks right past you, and you pick up your briefcase and you walk back to the elevator, and the doors close, and the world, quietly, without any announcement, changes.